Now that we understand how light works, we're going to look at how that interacts with our or human eyes to help us see. So the process, it's basically 4 steps for how humans see. The first step here is that light is focused by the lens in your eye. So your eye, if you don't know what your eye looks like, it's basically a big sphere with a lens at the front. So light comes in, all sorts of stuff, and then it gets focused by that lens. Then it's focused by the lens and it strikes the back of your eye here. So it strikes the back and it's focused onto the back. The cones in the back of your eye, which are just a fancy specific type of cell. So it's a special light sensitive cell. They activate based on how much light is hitting them. So if like a bright light is hitting them, they get really active. If a dim light is hitting them, they are not so active. And I'll talk about the 3 types of cones later, so if you're following along in the guided notes, put a pause on that and we'll come back to it. But they activate. Then those cones send signals to the brain. So they basically say, here's how bright the light hitting me is. Here's how much I'm activating. And then the brain interprets the signals as an image. So it's a pretty simple process. It's just there's lots of cool stuff that happens. So light gets focused by the lens in your eye, and that lens focuses it onto the cones at the back of the eye. Those cones absorb the light and say, here's how bright the light is. They send that signal to the brain, and the brain interprets that signal as an image. So some additional detail. On the back of your eye, this isn't how, well, we can sketch pretty close to how it is. So on the back of your eye, you've got a kind of spot in the middle where there's no cones because of your optic nerve. And then you've got a bunch of cones kind of scattered around it. And some of those cones are sensitive to red light. So you'll want to take that note up above. Some of them are sensitive to red light. Some of them are sensitive to green light. So that's 2 of the colors that our eyes are sensitive to. Red light and green light. And some of them are most sensitive to blue light. And I'm doing a little bit of hand waving here with the work, but you kind of get the idea that basically the back of our eyes can sense 3 colors the best, red, green, and blue. But what's actually happening, if you imagine a graph here of what those, well, we'll get into it later. But what you can see here now is if an image is on the back of here, say a smiley face, you can see that around the outside of the smiley face, those cones will be hit by light. On the smile, those cones will be hit by light, and on the 2 eyes, some cones will be hit by light. So in other words, our brain knows where the light's hitting the cones because, all these cones in the middle here, these 2 blue ones, they're not being activated. This red one's not being activated. These green ones out here aren't being activated. So this is what's happening in our eyes, although with a much more complicated situation. All the cones are being activated by the light that's hitting them, which means they're basically having a picture on the back of your eye of whatever's in front of you, and then all the cones in the different locations are activated. So I told you in that previous slide that human eyes are sensitive to red, green, and blue. So the question is, how come we can see more than red, green, and blue objects, right? Like when we look around the world, we don't just see red, green, and blue. Well, they're most sensitive to red, green, and blue, but they're kind of sensitive to other colors. So you can imagine something like this. So the red cones, this is, say, red. And then we have, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. If you want to think about kind of your standard rainbow along like this. So red is really sensitive to red light, but it's also pretty sensitive to orange light here. Like, we got a pretty high bump on our curve. And then the green, we'll have a similar thing with green, and a similar thing with blue. Let me have the better blue here. So now what'll happen, what that means is if you have yellow light in here, so you've got yellow light, what's going to happen is your red cones activate a little bit, and your green cones activate a little bit, and your brain then knows, okay, I've got some red and some green, so it must be a color in between red and green. And that's how we see, or our brain interprets a color yellow. Similarly, if you have like a turquoisey, tealy color, that's because you've got some green and some blue activating to light that up. Orange, will just be more red than green, but still a little bit of green down here. And this is how we see kind of different colors. And then if all of them are really active, our brain interprets that as the color white. If none of them are really active, our brain interprets that as black. So this is how we see more than 3 colors. And what's actually very cool and interesting and fun is our brains can see colors that don't exist. So for example, you see on here we've got all these colors. Well, what would happen if your red cones really lit up and your blue cones really lit up? Well, that's not a color because, right, this is because 2 parts are being lit up simultaneously. 2 parts of the spectrum are being lit up. Whereas before, with like yellow light, it's 1 part activating 2 cones. But if we get these really far apart cones activated, our brain interprets that as magenta, which is, I don't have it on here, but you can Google magenta. It's like that really bright pinkish purpley color. That is a color that technically, physically, in the real world does not exist. There's no light that is magenta colored. It's what our brain understands when red and blue light hit our brains. It thinks magenta. So that's a color that doesn't exist. There's some other colors that don't technically exist that happen when our brains do things. I think I'll have a video linked about some of these colors. If I forget to put that up, let me know, but you'll be able to see that on the lesson page of some of these imaginary or non-real colors. Okay, lastly, how amazing the brain is at interpreting data. We talked about 1, it can make up colors that don't exist for what's happening when the red and the blue cones activate. But also if we go back, there's this hole in the middle here. This is where your optical nerve connects to your eyeball that takes the signal. Anything that's basically straight in front of you, or the light that should be going kind of straight to the back of your eye, I should say, your eye doesn't detect because it's hitting the optic nerve, it's not hitting cones. So there's a hole in the center of our vision that's a blind spot. But we're not used, like when we look around, most of us don't have like, these blacked out spots in front of our eyes. And that's because our brain, as we look around, we naturally scan across an environment. And so that blind spot moves across the environment, but our brain has adapted and like been built specifically to fill in that blind spot. So as long as we, have moved ever so slightly, basically our brain fills in with the, what it assumes is there. And even if our brain doesn't have that data, like we've never seen it, we just open our eyes for the first time, our brain extrapolates what should be there based on assuming, well, if there's a bunch of gray on this side and a bunch of gray on that side, there's probably gray in the middle. And you can do all sorts of fun things to kind of figure out where your blind spot is, of like moving fingers in front of your eyes and stuff like that. You can look up those exercises. But it's just really neat that our brain fills it in and we're not even aware that there's technically should be a missing chunk from our vision as we work with it. I also just want to mention kind of how our brain is taking in so much information from two different sources and then understanding that as depth and all sorts of things. If you want to talk about more of the cool bits and pieces of how our brains work interpreting visual data, talk to me in class sometime because I'd love to talk about it. But most of it's not super relevant for what we're trying to worry about here. So that'll wrap us up here. Next, you'll take a look at how computers see in a similar fashion.